The rope was already around Elijah Atkins's neck when the sound of a galloping horse cut through the murmur of the crowd gathered in the dusty square of Cedar Bend. He stood on the platform with his hands bound before him, the late August sun pressing hot against his shoulders, smoke from the distant hills hanging low and yellow over the rooftops like a bad omen nobody wanted to name aloud. Marshal Cole Dunning stood beside the lever, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet the crowd. Land Commissioner Randall Vance watched from the shade of the feed store awning, arms folded, a thin smile tucked beneath his mustache. Beside him, Silas Croft leaned against a hitching post with the easy comfort of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. Elijah did not close his eyes. He had led wagon trains through Shoshone raids, through blizzards in the Bitterroots, through a river crossing that had taken 2 mules and nearly taken him, and he was not going to close his eyes now, not even with a noose scratching at his collar for a murder he had not committed. Then he heard the hoofbeats, and something in his chest loosened before his mind even understood why. "Stop this hanging." The voice rang out clear and furious across the square, and the crowd turned as one to see Sadie Bailey riding in at a hard gallop, her sorrel mare lathered white with sweat, her skirts hiked and tucked for riding, a canvas satchel clutched against her side like it held the only thing keeping the world upright. She hauled the mare up so sharply the animal reared, and half the square gasped, but Sadie kept her seat the way she kept everything, with a stubbornness that had outlasted better men than most who doubted her. "Marshal Dunning," she said, breathless, swinging down before the horse had fully stopped, "you will not drop that lever, not until you have heard what I have to say." Dunning's hand hovered near the lever, uncertain. "Mrs. Bailey, this is a lawful sentence, handed down by judge, handed down on the word of a man who was paid to lie," Sadie said, striding forward, and the crowd parted for her the way water parts for a boat that refuses to slow. She reached into her satchel and drew out a torn scrap of fringed leather, and beside it, a slim ledger book with a red ribbon marking a page. This piece of coat was caught on a snag not 40 yards from where Deputy Holly's was found. I pulled it free myself the morning after he died, before anyone thought to look. It matches no coat in this town save one, and every soul here has seen Reeve Tanner wearing it. A murmur went through the crowd. Reeve Tanner, standing near the back with his hat pulled low, went very still. "That is nothing but a scrap of leather," Vance called out smoothly, stepping forward. "It proves nothing, Mrs. Bailey, and I would remind you that interrupting a lawful execution is—" "I am not finished, Commissioner." Sadie opened the ledger and held it high enough for the nearest rows to see. "This is my account book. On the night Deputy Holly's was killed, Elijah Atkins was at my homestead, 11 miles from town, delivering lumber and extending credit against my husband's contract, because the bank would not so much as look at a widow's signature. He signed this page himself at 8:30 in the evening by lamplight, and I signed beside him. He did not leave my land until well past 10. There is no horse alive that could carry a man 11 miles of river road and back again in time to do what you have accused him of." The square had gone entirely silent now, except for the wind moving through the pines above town, carrying with it the faint, bitter smell of smoke. "She's lying to save her own reputation," Croft said lazily, but there was an edge beneath the laziness now, a tightness at his jaw that had not been there a moment before. "A widow alone with a man at night. Ask yourselves what kind of testimony that really is." "Ask yourselves," Sadie said, turning to face the crowd fully, her voice shaking now not with fear but with fury. "Why a coat scrap and a signed ledger frighten a man more than a rope around an innocent neck? I have told the truth of where I was and who I was with, and I will stand by it before God and every gossip in this county. What I want to know, Marshal, is why you are so eager to hang a man on the word of a drunk and a coat that fits Reeve Tanner far better than it ever fit Elijah Atkins." Dunning looked at the rope. He looked at Vance. He looked, finally, at the scrap of leather Sadie held out toward him, and something in his weathered face gave way. The way a dam gives way not all at once, but in the moment a man decides he can no longer bear the weight of what he has been holding back. "Cut him down," Dunning said. The crowd erupted, some in relief, some in anger, and in the chaos Elijah felt the rope loosen from his throat and strong hands, Sadie's hands, steadying him as his knees threatened to buckle from 6 hours of standing bound in the sun. "You came," he said, hoarse, staring at her as though he could not quite believe the shape of her standing there in the dust with soot on her sleeve and fire in her eyes. "I was not about to let them hang an innocent man over my ledger book," Sadie said, though her voice cracked on the last word. And for a moment, before the crowd swallowed them both, she looked at him the way a person looks at something they have only just realized they cannot afford to lose. The days that followed were not gentle ones. Elijah was freed but not cleared, not fully, and Cedar Bend was a town built on the kind of gossip that clung tighter than smoke to a coat. Some folks thanked Sadie in the mercantile line, pressed her hand, told her she had done a brave thing. Others would not meet her eye at all, murmured behind gloved fingers about a widow spending her evenings alone with a man not her husband, about what kind of woman rode into town shouting down a marshal in front of God and everybody. Sadie had never much cared what was whispered about her, not since Thomas died and left her to prove, day after day, that a woman could drive a nail true and square a beam without a man standing over her shoulder. But she cared, a little, about what was whispered about Elijah, and that surprised her more than she wanted to admit. She found him 3 days after the hanging, back behind the counter of his store as though nothing at all had happened, weighing out flour for old Mrs. Odette Hargrove, who ran the boarding house and who talked more than anyone else in the county but meant well by most of it. "You ought not be standing here like a man waiting for lightning to strike twice," Sadie said, setting her own small list on the counter, a length of rope, 2 pounds of nails, a paper of needles. "Where else would I stand?" Elijah said, and there was something dry and tired in his voice, though his eyes when they found hers held none of the exhaustion. "I have run freight wagons through worse than gossip, Mrs. Bailey." "You ran freight wagons through Shoshone country and blizzards, from what I hear told." "That too." He measured her nails without being asked, added an extra fistful the way he had taken to doing these past months, and did not mention the debt growing quietly in the ledger beneath his counter, the one she had not paid down since spring, the one no bank in 3 counties would have extended in the first place. "You keep giving me more than I ask for," Sadie said, watching him. "You keep needing more than you ask for," Elijah answered. "There is a difference between charity and sense, Mrs. Bailey. A bridge unfinished helps no one. A bridge finished helps every rancher and family between here and the Awahi crossing who is tired of paying Silas Croft's toll to use a road that ought to belong to all of them." It was the most either of them had said aloud about why he had first extended her credit, back in the spring, when the bank had turned her away twice, and her husband's old lumber supplier had suddenly, mysteriously, stopped answering her letters. Elijah had never asked her to explain herself. He had simply opened the ledger, written her name at the top of a fresh page, and told her the store would carry what she needed until the county paid out on the contract. She had not known then that it would cost him nearly his life. "I mean to pay every cent of it back," she said, now quieter. "I know you do." He slid the parcel across the counter to her, and for a moment his fingers rested near hers, not quite touching, close enough that she felt the warmth of it anyway. "That is why I am not worried." Outside, the sky had taken on a strange copper cast, the sun dimmed to a dull coin behind drifting haze. Somewhere north, in the high timber above the Piet, fire was already beginning to walk the ridgelines, though neither of them yet knew how soon it would come to matter. The bridge sat half-finished across a narrow, rocky stretch of the Piet River, 4 miles upstream from Cedar Bend, its raw new timbers pale against the older gray stone piers her husband had set 2 years before. Sadie rode out to it most mornings before the heat came on, and it was there, a week after the hanging, that Elijah found her balanced on a crossbeam 20 feet above the water, driving a spike home with 3 clean strokes of a hammer that would have done credit to any man in the territory. "You might have waited for your hired hand," he called up, dismounting. "Amos has gone to fetch more pitch for the joints," Sadie said without looking down, driving the spike the rest of the way flush. "And I have been climbing beams since I was 9 years old, Mr. Atkins. My father built ships on the Maumee River. I could set a joint before I could spell my own name properly. I do not doubt it." He watched her a moment longer, the easy competence of her movements, the way she checked each beam with her palm before trusting her weight to it, and felt something warm and unfamiliar settle behind his ribs. "I came because I found something in the yard behind the store this morning. Thought you ought to see it." She climbed down without hurry, wiping pitch from her hands onto her apron, and took the folded paper he held out. It was a page torn from a supply ledger, not his own hand, listing lumber deliveries to the bridge site that had never actually arrived, dated across the past 3 months, each one signed off by a county clerk's stamp that Sadie recognized as belonging to Vance's office. "They are building a paper trail," she said slowly, understanding breaking over her like cold water. "Making it look as though the county paid for lumber I never received, as though I have been pocketing county funds. Or building toward a claim that your contract is in default," Elijah said. "Either way, it points toward the same end. They mean to take the bridge from you." Sadie looked out at the river, at the 2 piers standing solid where her husband had set them before he fell to his death from a scaffold that folks had called an accident, and felt the old grief twist alongside a new and colder anger. "They will not have it," she said. That night, smoke thickened enough that the moon rose the color of a blood orange, and somewhere far up the canyon a cougar screamed, driven down out of the high country ahead of something worse. Elijah had ridden back out to check the bridge site after dark, uneasy in a way he could not fully name, and so it was that he heard the first crack of splitting wood before the fire that lit the darkness came from flame rather than lightning. He found 3 men working by lantern light at the base of the near pier, saws already through half the new crossbeam Sadie had spent a week setting, and Reeve Tanner standing watch with a rifle across his knees. "Evening, Atkins," Tanner said, not bothering to rise. "Funny thing, a bridge burning down in fire season. Nobody will ask too many questions." "Nobody but me," Elijah said, and stepped his horse forward slow and steady, the way he had learned to move toward trouble on 100 trail drives, never fast enough to spook a man into a mistake, never slow enough to look afraid. "Put down the saws." One of the men laughed, but it was Tanner who raised the rifle, and it was in that same instant that Sadie's voice cut across the dark from the far bank, sharp and commanding. "Drop it, Mr. Tanner, or I will put a ball through that fine silver hatband of yours." She stood at the tree line with her late husband's old shotgun braced against her shoulder, moonlight catching along the barrel, and though her hands were not entirely steady, her voice did not waver at all. For one long breath nobody moved. Then Tanner, weighing a woman's shotgun against a wagon master's reputation for never backing down from a standoff, lowered his rifle a fraction, cursed under his breath, and called his men off the beams. "This is not finished," he said, backing toward the horses tethered in the dark. "No," Elijah agreed, "it is not." They rode away into the smoke-hazed night, and Elijah crossed to where Sadie still stood, shotgun lowering slowly in her grip, her whole body beginning to shake now that the danger had passed. "You should not have come out here alone," he said, though there was no scolding in it, only a rough note of fear for her that surprised them both. "I was not about to let them burn 2 years of my life to the waterline," Sadie said, and then, quieter, "You should not have ridden in on 3 armed men with nothing but words, Elijah." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both seemed to hear it land. "I have talked worse men than Reeve Tanner down off worse ledges than this," he said. "Come on. Let us see what they managed to cut through before we lost them." 2 beams needed replacing entirely, a loss of nearly a week's work, but the piers held, and as they worked together by lantern light to assess the damage, something else took shape between them in the smoky dark, unspoken but no longer entirely deniable. Word of the sabotage reached the Cedar Bend Sentinel 3 days later, carried there by Amos Higgins, who had seen the cut beams with his own eyes and was not a man inclined to keep quiet about it. Editor Josiah Whitfield, who had spent the better part of a decade watching Silas Crofts Toll Road bleed every rancher and freighter between Cedar Bend and Idaho City dry, printed the story on his front page beneath a headline that named names none of the town's other papers had dared print before. Public opinion, which had wavered uneasily since the hanging, began at last to tip. Ranchers who had quietly paid Crofts tolls for years, resenting every dollar, started speaking openly in the mercantile and the saloon about a free public crossing. Marshall Dunning, feeling the shift in the wind the way any man who has spent his life reading weather can feel it, began asking questions he had not dared ask before, questions about ledgers and lumber deliveries that never arrived. Vance and Croft did not wait to see which way that wind would finally settle. Within the week, a notice appeared nailed to the courthouse door, announcing that the estate of Thomas Bailey, deceased, was found to be in arrears to Boise County in the amount of $412 for lumber advanced against the bridge contract, and that absent immediate payment, the contract and all associated rights of way would be sold at public auction to the highest bidder in 3 weeks' time. Sadie stood before that notice with her hands clenched at her sides, reading it 3 times as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. $400, she said, when Elijah found her there. I have never seen a single delivery that debt is supposed to represent. It is a lie built entirely of paper. Then we will need paper of our own to answer it, Elijah said. 3 weeks is not long, but it is not nothing. She looked at him, at the steadiness in his face that had not once wavered since the day she saved him from the gallows, and felt something in her chest ache with a longing she had not let herself feel since Thomas died, the longing not to carry every weight alone. The fire came sooner than the auction, and worse than anyone had feared. It began as a haze on the northern ridgeline, the kind of smoke that had hung over Cedar Bend for weeks and had grown so familiar folks had nearly stopped remarking on it. Then, on a hot, dry evening with a wind out of the canyon that felt like a bellows working a forge, the haze became a glow, and the glow became a wall of flame moving down through the pines faster than any horse could run. Elijah was in his store when the first rider came pounding down the main street, shouting that the Larson and Whitcomb spreads were already burning, that the fire had jumped the ridge road and was coming down the canyon toward the scattered ranches along the river, toward families with nowhere to run but the one road out, the toll road, Crofts Road. He did not hesitate. 15 years of running freight and family wagons through country that did not forgive hesitation had taught him exactly what came next. "Ring the bell," he told his young stock boy, and within minutes the church bell was tolling out across Cedar Bend, the old signal for gather and go, and Elijah was already saddling his horse and shouting for every able wagon in town to follow him up the river road. Sadie met him at the edge of town, already ahorse, her face set with the same grim purpose he had come to recognize as entirely her own. "The Larson place has 6 children," she said. "And old Mrs. Petrov cannot walk far on that hip of hers. I am coming." "I would not try to stop you," he said, and meant it, and something passed between them in that moment that was not quite a promise but was close enough to one. They rode into smoke so thick it stung the eyes and turned the sun into a smear of dull red, ash falling like gray snow across the wagon ruts, the roar of the fire audible now even over the wind. Elijah organized the ranch families with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this before in different country against different dangers, loading children and the elderly first, lashing down what possessions could be saved, keeping the wagon train moving at a pace fast enough to outrun the flames without outrunning the slowest wagon's ability to keep up. The trouble came, as Elijah had half expected it would at Croft's toll gate, where the river road narrowed between a cut bank in the water and a heavy timber gate barred the way, manned by two of Croft's men who had apparently decided that fire or no fire, the toll was still the toll. $5 a wagon, one of them called out as the train approached, rifle held loose but visible. Same as always. There are children in these wagons and fire coming down that canyon behind us, Elijah said, reining up before the gate, his voice carrying the flat, immovable authority he had once used to face down river pirates and cattle rustlers alike. Open the gate. Mr. Croft's orders. No pay, no pass. Behind them, the roar of the fire had grown loud enough that the youngest Larson boy had begun to cry, and smoke rolled down the canyon in a black curtain that left no room for argument or delay. It was Sadie who moved first, walking her horse forward past Elijah's, and it was Sadie's shotgun, the same one that had turned back Reeve Tanner at the bridge, that she now leveled steady at the gatekeeper's chest. "There is a family of 6 behind me and a widow with a bad hip behind them," she said, "and you are going to open that gate, or I am going to put a hole through it myself, and you along with it if you are still standing there." The gatekeeper looked at her, looked at the fire lighting the sky orange behind the wagons, looked at Elijah's own steady, unblinking readiness, and made the only sensible calculation available to a man being paid far too little to die for a toll gate. He opened it. The wagon train poured through, and Elijah led them not along the exposed river road, which the fire was already beginning to lick at from the ridge above, but down along a lower cattle track close to the water's edge that he remembered from years of freighting this country, a route few but the oldest hands still knew. It was there, at a narrow washout where a spring flood had years before torn away a section of the old crossing, that they found the way blocked entirely, a 10-foot gap of raw eroded bank between them and the safety of the flat ground beyond, with fire now visible on the ridge directly above them, close enough that the heat of it pressed against their faces like an open oven door. "We cannot get the wagons across," Amos Higgins shouted, panic edging his voice for the first time. Sadie was already off her horse, running the bank line with a practiced eye, measuring the gap, the depth, the angle of the far side. "The old bridge timbers," she called back. "The ones we pulled off the pier last week when we replaced them. They are still stacked at the base of camp, not a quarter-mile back." Elijah understood at once, and within minutes half the men from the wagon train were hauling the salvaged beams down the track, while Sadie directed the placement with the same calm authority she brought to every joint and beam of her husband's bridge, spanning the gap with 2 long timbers braced against boulders on either side, lashing them fast with wagon rope, and whatever chain could be scavenged, testing the span herself first. Walking its length while smoke rolled thick overhead and embers began to drift down like burning snow. "It will hold 1 wagon at a time, slow and steady," she said. "No faster than a walk." One by one, the wagons crossed that makeshift bridge while the fire crested the ridge above them and came roaring down the far slope, close enough now that the roar of it drowned even the crying of the youngest children. Elijah stayed at the crossing until the last wagon, old Mrs. Petrov's, had made it safely over, and then he and Sadie crossed together, leading their horses by hand across timbers that groaned and shifted beneath their combined weight, the heat of the advancing fire scorching the air behind them the entire way. They reached the flat ground beyond just as the fire swept down to the water's edge behind them, hissing and roaring where it met the river, unable to cross, and the whole exhausted, soot-blackened company stood and watched the flames rage along the far bank, held at bay at last by nothing more than water and a river they had all just barely managed to reach in time. "You saved every soul in this train," Elijah said quietly, coming to stand beside Sadie as she watched the fire burn itself out along the opposite shore, her face streaked with ash and something that might have been tears or might simply have been the sting of smoke. "We saved them," she corrected. I could not have gotten a single wagon moving without you leading it." He looked at her then, really looked, at the soot on her cheek and the exhaustion in her shoulders and the fierce, unbroken will still burning behind her eyes despite everything the day had asked of her, and felt something settle inside him that he had spent 15 years of solitary trail riding carefully avoiding. "Sadie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name aloud. "I do not know how to say this without it sounding like the words of an exhausted man talking foolishness in front of a fire, but I find I do not much want to spend my evenings in that store without knowing you are going to walk through the door of it before closing time." She laughed, a startled, watery sound, and pressed the back of her wrist against her eyes. "Elijah Atkins, if you are trying to tell me you have feelings for me, you have chosen the single worst possible moment, covered head to foot in soot with half the county's ranch families watching us not 10 feet away. I have led wagon trains through worse timing than this," he said, and something in the dry humor of it broke the tightness in her chest, and she laughed again, freer this time, and did not pull away when he reached for her hand. "I am not an easy woman to court," she said, quieter now. "I buried a husband who loved me well but who also, I think, never quite believed I could finish what I started without him. I will not be that kind of wife again." Elijah leaned on until I forget how to stand alone. "I do not want you leaning on me instead of standing," he said. "I want to stand beside you. There is a difference, Sadie, same as there is a difference between charity and sense." She looked up at him, at the fire dying slowly along the far bank, at the wagon train full of saved families settling for the night around scattered cook fires, and for the first time since Thomas died, allowed herself to imagine a future that did not require carrying everything alone. But the fire that had nearly taken them was not the last danger waiting in that long, hard summer, and neither of them yet knew how close the coming weeks would bring them to losing everything they had only just begun to hope for. They returned to Cedar Bend 3 days later to a town transformed by what the wagon train had survived. Whitfield's paper ran the story of the crossing at the washout beneath a headline calling Sadie Bailey, the woman who built a bridge in an hour to save 6 families from the flames. And for a few golden days, it seemed as though public sentiment had turned decisively, that Croft and Vance's grip on the county might finally be loosening. Then Judge Horace Pruitt arrived from Boise to preside over both the murder investigation and the matter of the disputed contract debt, and the ground shifted beneath them entirely. Pruitt was not, as Whitfield's paper had hoped, an incorruptible territorial judge eager to right old wrongs. He was, Elijah recognized within an hour of the man's arrival, exactly the sort of judge who had ridden the circuit long enough to know which men in a county controlled which votes and which contracts, and Vance had clearly spent the intervening weeks ensuring the judge arrived with a favorable disposition already firmly in place. "The matter of Deputy Hollis's death remains under investigation," Pruitt announced from the courthouse steps, "and Mr. Atkins will not be rearrested absent new evidence." However, he paused, consulting a paper Vance had handed him not 5 minutes before. "The matter of the Bailey contract debt is a civil matter separate from any criminal proceeding, and I see no cause to delay the scheduled auction. It will proceed as planned, 1 week from today." "1 week," Sadie said afterward, standing outside the courthouse with her hands trembling with barely contained fury. "They have moved it up 2 weeks. They know we do not have enough time to prove the debt is fabricated." Worse news came that same evening, delivered by a shamefaced young man named Otis Reed, the drunk whose testimony had helped condemn Elijah in the first place. He came to the store after dark, hat in hand, and confessed to Elijah that he had been paid $20 by a man he would not name, though everyone understood well enough who, to say he had seen Elijah near the murder scene that night. He had not, he admitted, seen anything of the sort. But when Elijah pressed him to say so publicly to Whitfield, to the marshal, Reed's courage failed him entirely. "They will kill me," he said, and fled into the dark before Elijah could argue further. It was that same night, going through the last of her husband's old tool chests in search of some earlier receipt that might prove the fabricated lumber debt false, that Sadie found the letter that changed everything. It was tucked beneath a false bottom in Thomas Bailey's carpenter's chest, water-stained and half illegible, dated only weeks before his death, addressed to Sadie but never sent. "My dearest Sadie," it began, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to prevent me from telling you myself, and I am sorrier for that than I can say. Croft has offered me $200 to leave a flaw in the North Pier that will fail within a year or two, quiet enough to look like poor workmanship, so his toll road stays the only safe crossing for years to come. I have refused him twice now. He does not take refusal well. I have hidden a copy of the original 1884 land office grant beneath the cornerstone of the North Pier, the one that sets aside this crossing as public right-of-way forever, so that no man, not Croft, not Vance, not anyone after me, can ever claim this land as private property to be bought and sold. If anything should happen to me, look there first." Sadie read the letter 3 times through tears she could not stop, and then rode through the dark to find Elijah, the letter clutched in her hand, the truth of her husband's death finally, terribly clear. "He did not fall," she said, when Elijah opened the door to find her standing there, soaked with tears and river mud both. "They killed him. They killed Thomas because he would not let them ruin the bridge, the same as they tried to kill you because you would not stop helping me." Elijah took her into the store, sat her down, poured coffee neither of them drank, and let her grief and fury pour out until it burned itself down to something colder and more purposeful. "There is a document," she said finally, wiping her face with the back of her hand, "beneath the cornerstone of the North Pier. If it says what Thomas wrote it says, it proves this land was never private property to auction in the first place." "Then we need to reach it before the auction," Elijah said, "and we need a certified copy from the Territorial Land Office in Boise to stand up against Vance's lawyers, because a hidden paper alone will not be enough. They will say we forged it ourselves." "Boise is 2 days' ride each way," Sadie said. "The auction is in 6. "Then I had better not waste any of them," Elijah said, and by dawn he was already saddled and gone, riding hard for the territorial capital while Sadie remained behind to guard the bridge, and the cornerstone, and whatever proof still lay hidden beneath it, with only Amos Higgins and a stubborn will for company. The days Elijah was away were the longest of Sadie's life, though not for the reasons she might once have expected. She had spent 2 years since Thomas's death proving to herself and to Cedar Bend that she needed no one. And now she found herself standing at the edge of the bridge site each evening, watching the road south for a rider who was not yet due, feeling the absence of him like a missing tooth, a tenderness she kept probing despite the ache. On the 3rd day, Silas Croft himself rode out to the bridge, alone, which surprised her enough that she did not immediately reach for the shotgun leaning against the sawhorse. "You have caused me more trouble than any woman has a right to cause a man," Croft said, dismounting, his voice carrying none of the easy menace he usually wore in town, something rower beneath it instead. "I am prepared to offer you a fair sum for the contract, Mrs. Bailey, enough to leave this county and start fresh somewhere the Bailey name does not carry so much weight in the wrong direction." "You mean enough to buy my silence about what you did to my husband," Sadie said, not moving from where she stood. Something flickered across Croft's face, gone as quickly as it came, but she had seen it, the flash of a man realizing his secret was no longer entirely secret. "Thomas Bailey fell from a scaffold," Croft said. "A tragic accident. Thomas Bailey refused to sabotage this bridge for you, and you had him killed for it," Sadie said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "The same as you had Deputy Hollies killed for asking too many questions about your tolls and tried to have Elijah Atkins hanged for it. I know the truth now, Mr. Croft, and paper does not burn as easily as you might hope." Croft's expression hardened. "You are alone out here, Mrs. Bailey. Your storekeeper is 2 days gone. It would be a simple thing for this bridge to burn tonight, cornerstone and all, before he ever returns." "It would be," Sadie agreed, and reached slowly, deliberately for the shotgun. If I were fool enough to leave it unguarded, which I am not, and if half a dozen ranch families whose lives your toll road nearly cost them did not now owe their gratitude to the very bridge you are threatening. Burn it if you dare, Mr. Croft, and see how quickly this county turns on you once Whitfield's paper tells them why. Croft looked at her for a long moment, weighing threat against consequence the way men like him always did, and finally swung back up onto his horse. "The auction will still happen," he said. "Papers or no papers, my lawyers know how to make a judge see reason." "We will see," Sadie said, and did not lower the shotgun until he had ridden entirely out of sight. That night, by lantern light, with Amos Higgins keeping watch at the tree line, Sadie pried loose the mortared stone at the base of the north pier and found, wrapped in oilcloth exactly as Thomas's letter had promised, a certified copy of the 1884 territorial land grant, its seal still intact, establishing the crossing as public right-of-way in perpetuity, unsellable, unmortgageable, belonging to no man and to every family who might ever need to cross that river in safety. She held it against her chest and wept, finally, for Thomas, for the 2 years of grief she had carried alone, and for the fierce, unbearable hope that Elijah might return in time to help her use it. Elijah reached Boise in a day and a half of hard riding, arriving at the territorial land office with dust in every seam of his clothes, and a desperation he had not felt since his earliest years running freight through hostile country. The clerk there, an elderly man named Fletcher who remembered the original 1884 grant well, since he had processed it himself, was more than willing to provide a certified duplicate once Elijah explained what was at stake, and even more willing once he learned the name Vance was attached to the scheme. Vance tried something similar 4 years back with a stretch of grazing land near Emmett, Fletcher said, shaking his head as he worked the official seal. "We stopped him then. Ought to have watched him closer since." Elijah rode back through the second night rather than resting, trusting his horse and the moon and 15 years of instinct to keep him on the road, and reached Cedar Bend on the morning of the auction, with the certified document folded inside his coat, and dust caked thick enough on his face that Sadie did not recognize him at first when he rode into the bridge site an hour before the courthouse bell was set to ring. Then he swung down from the horse, and she saw his eyes and recognized him entirely, and crossed the distance between them at a run. "You made it," she said, against his chest, her voice muffled and thick with relief. "I would have ridden through fire itself to make it," he said, and held her there a long moment before either of them remembered there was still a battle left to fight. The courthouse steps were crowded that morning, more crowded than Cedar Bend had seen since the hanging, word having spread through the county that something significant was about to happen at the auction of the Bailey contract. Vance stood at the top of the steps beside the county auctioneer, a nervous man named Pettibone who clearly wished himself elsewhere, while Croft watched from the crowd with 2 of his hired men flanking him, and Judge Pruitt sat at a table set up beneath the courthouse awning, ready to certify whatever outcome the auction produced. "The property and contract rights known as the Bailey Bridge and Crossing," Pettibone called out, reading from a paper Vance had handed him, "forfeit for debt owed to Boise County, to be sold this day to the highest bidder. Do I hear an opening offer?" $50, called a man Sadie recognized as one of Croft's front investors, a thin fellow named Sorley who ran the Awahi Development Company that existed, as far as anyone could tell, entirely on paper. "I bid the debt itself paid in full," Sadie called out, striding forward through the crowd with Elijah at her side. $412 in cash, which I have here and now, rendering this auction entirely unnecessary." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Vance's smile flickered. "The county is not obligated to accept late payment once an auction has been properly announced," Vance said smoothly. "The sale will proceed." "Then perhaps the county would care to explain," Elijah said, stepping up onto the courthouse steps himself, unfolding the certified document from Boise and holding it high enough for the whole crowd to see. why it believes it has any authority to sell this land at all, when the territory of Idaho deeded this exact crossing as public right-of-way in the year 1884, unsellable and unmortgageable by any private party, county included. The crowd's murmur rose to something louder now, and Pettibone looked at the document Elijah held, then at Vance, with the expression of a man who very much wished he had chosen a different line of work. "That document is a forgery," Vance said, too quickly, and Sadie stepped forward with her own copy, the original found beneath the cornerstone, its seal matching Elijah's exactly. "Then perhaps the Territorial Land Office itself is engaged in forgery, Commissioner, since this copy was certified 2 days ago by the same clerk who processed the original grant in 1884, and matches precisely the copy my late husband hid beneath this very bridge before he was murdered for refusing to sabotage it on Silas Croft's orders." The word murdered landed on the crowd like a struck match, and Judge Pruitt, who had clearly not been briefed on this particular complication, rose from his table with considerably less certainty than he had shown all week. "That is a serious accusation, Mrs. Bailey," he said. "It is a true one," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd, and every head turned to see Reeve Tanner himself pushing forward, his hat off, his hands raised, flanked by Marshal Dunning, who had clearly taken him into custody sometime in the last hour and brought him here for reasons of his own. "I cut Thomas Bailey's scaffold rope on Croft's orders 2 years back," Tanner said, his voice unsteady but carrying clearly across the silent square. "And I killed Deputy Hollies the same way, because he was asking too many questions about the toll money going into Croft's pocket and Vance's both. I am done hanging for another man's orders. I would rather take my chances telling the truth." Whatever hold Croft and Vance had maintained over Cedar Bend for years broke entirely in that moment, the crowd's mood shifting from murmur to open outrage in the space of a single breath. Dunning, finding at last the courage the town's changed sentiment had given him, moved to take Croft into custody, and though Croft's 2 hired men reached for their guns, the sight of a dozen angry ranchers surging forward, men whose families Elijah and Sadie had led to safety from the fire not 3 weeks before, was enough to convince them that this was not a fight worth dying for. Vance tried to flee through the crowd and made it perhaps 20 feet before Whitfield, of all people, tripped him neatly with a rolled-up copy of his own newspaper and sat on him until Dunning arrived to finish the job. Judge Pruitt, faced with a certified land grant, a confessed murderer, and a courthouse square full of witnesses to both, found his sense of judicial impartiality returning to him with remarkable speed. "The auction is void," he announced, raising his voice over the continuing commotion. "The debt against the Bailey estate is declared fraudulent, struck from the county record. Mrs. Bailey retains full rights to complete her contract, and this crossing is confirmed as public right-of-way, as it has been these past 4 years and shall remain. I will further be recommending a full territorial investigation into the conduct of Commissioner Vance's office." It was not, perhaps, the swiftest justice either Sadie or Elijah might have wished for Croft and Vance, who would face trial rather than immediate punishment, but it was enough, standing there in the courthouse square with the truth finally spoken aloud before the whole county, and Sadie found she did not need more than that in order to finally feel Thomas's death settle into something like peace rather than open wound. She turned to find Elijah watching her, dust-streaked and exhausted from 2 days of hard riding, and felt the whole weight of the past months lift from her shoulders all at once. "We did it," she said. "You did it," he corrected gently. "I only brought the paper. You brought the courage to use it. I could not have found any of it without you," she said, and this time, in front of the entire crowded square, she closed the distance between them herself and kissed him, soft and certain, and did not care one bit who might be watching or what they might whisper about it afterward. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of restored reputation and returning normalcy that felt, after everything, almost strange in its quietness. Croft and Vance were held for trial in Boise, their toll road dismantled by county order within the month, the old gatehouse left to fall into the same weeds that had grown up around so many of the small injustices men like them had built their fortunes upon. Tanner's confession, along with Otis Reed's own courage returning, once Croft was safely behind bars, was enough to see justice finally done for both Deputy Hollies and, at last, for Thomas Bailey, whose death was formally ruled a murder rather than an accident, a small but profound correction to a wrong that had gone unspoken for 2 years. Sadie finished the bridge in early October, the last plank set and pegged on a crisp, clear morning with the fire season finally broken by autumn rains, the smoke that had hung over the valley for so long washed clean from the sky at last. The whole county turned out to see it opened, wagons crossing free for the first time in years over water that had once cost every family a toll to pass. Elijah stood beside her at the center of the span as the first wagon crossed, an old rancher named Whitcomb driving his family home from a supply run, waving his hat and shouting his thanks as he passed. "Your husband would be proud of what you finished," Elijah said quietly. "He would be proud of what we finished," Sadie said, and slipped her hand into his without hesitation, the gesture no longer strange between them but as natural as breathing. "I have been thinking, Elijah, about something you said to me the night of the fire, about standing beside someone instead of leaning. I remember it. I find I do not only want you standing beside me on a burning riverbank," she said, turning to face him fully, the autumn sun bright on the new timbers around them. "I find I want you standing beside me for considerably longer than that, if you are still of a mind to court a woman who is not always easy to court." Elijah smiled, the kind of smile she had come to realize he saved for very few things in his life, and reached into his coat pocket to draw out a small ring, plain silver, clearly fashioned by a local smith rather than ordered from any catalog, its simplicity somehow more precious for that. "I rode to Boise for a land grant and came home with an idea I could not quite shake," he said. "I have been carrying this 3 weeks, waiting for the right crossing to ask you on. I do not think I will find a better one than this." "Elijah Atkins," Sadie said, laughing through sudden tears, "are you asking me to marry you in the middle of my own bridge?" "I'm asking you to marry me on the middle of our bridge," he said, "since I do not believe either of us built it alone, and I do not intend to build the rest of my life that way either." She said yes before he had even fully finished the question, and the small crowd of ranchers still crossing the new bridge that morning cheered loud enough to carry clear down the river valley. They were married 3 weeks later in the Cedar Bend church, a modest ceremony attended by nearly the whole county, Mrs. Odette Hargrove weeping happily in the front pew, Amos Higgins standing as Elijah's witness with evident pride, Whitfield's newspaper running an announcement on its front page that called it, with only slight exaggeration, the union of the two people who had saved Cedar Bend twice over in a single summer. In the months that followed, they built something new together out of everything each of them had spent years building alone. Elijah's store expanded to include a proper freight office, offering guided wagon passage along the now safe river road for families and merchants traveling between Cedar Bend and the mining camps upriver. His years of wagon mastering finally given a permanent home rather than a life spent constantly moving on. Sadie took on contract work as a carpenter and builder throughout the county, no longer having to fight quite so hard for men to trust a woman's hand at a beam and a level, her reputation secured by the bridge that still stood strong across the Piet, known now to everyone in the valley simply as Bailey's Crossing. They ran both ventures from the same wide plot of land at the edge of town, store and freight office on one side, Sadie's growing carpentry workshop on the other, a shared house between them with a porch that looked out over the river road where wagons now passed freely, morning and evening, toward a horizon no longer choked with smoke or shadowed by any man's greed. On quiet evenings, They sat together on that porch and watched the sun set gold over water that had once been used against so many, now flowing free beneath a bridge built first by grief and finished by love. And Sadie would sometimes reach for Elijah's hand the way she had that first morning on the finished span, not because she needed steadying, but because she had learned at last that there was no weakness in wanting someone beside her. Only the deep and abiding comfort of no longer having to stand entirely alone. Elijah, for his part, had spent 15 years believing a life spent guiding others to safety left no room for a home of his own, until the day a widow rode into town with proof in her hands and fire in her eyes, and taught him that the truest kind of safety a man could build was not a place at all, but a person, standing steady beside him through every crossing left to come.